The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've talked so much about the impact of gerrymandering, and we now have a really interesting study from North Carolina from 2012 that shows us the impact of gerrymandering. Back in 2012, more North Carolinians voted for Democrats than Republicans in their congressional elections, but Republicans still won 9 out of the state's 13 seats that year. This made Duke researchers interested in trying to see what the mathematical explanation was for this discrepancy, and they published their results. They went in with what they described as an open mind. They said, maybe the discrepancies are because of geographical differences, or maybe there's some gerrymandering that's affecting a couple of seats. In any case, they went in and they wanted the numbers. So the two researchers, Mattingly and Vaughn, both graduates of the North Carolina School of Science and Math, created a bunch of district maps, different maps of how you could draw the lines between the districts. And they used the exact same vote totals, but just with different borders. And their work was governed by the two principles of redistricting. One, there's a federal rule that requires each district to have about the same population. And number two, a state rule that requires the congressional districts to be compact, meaning you can't, in an attempt to prevent blatant gerrymandering, you can't have a district that is, just some kind of weird L shape that stretches along the rural edges of the state, for example. I think that's the general idea of the compact requirement. Compact is obviously more subjective. In Massachusetts, there have been districts that stretch weirdly across the state in ways that don't really make sense. But regardless, this is the idea. When they tabulated what would have happened had residents voted the same way but in differently drawn districts, it turns out that the balance of the congressional seats in 100 different maps would have been way more equal under most scenarios. So in other words, he shows a bar chart that shows most of the scenarios see Democrats elected in 7 or 8 of those 13 seats. Remember, Democrats got slightly more than 50% of the vote, and Democrats would have received under almost all of the scenarios in which you could draw districts more than 50% of the seats. However, the actual district lines, Lewis, were such that it was one of the few scenarios that led to Republicans losing the popular vote and winning 9 of 13 seats.
I would be very curious to hear from our international listeners on gerrymandering. I know we talked to them about the healthcare stuff, but just, what do you think about gerrymandering, and what do you think would happen if politicians in your country were trying to redraw the lines of a district for the sole purpose of getting more votes?
And we often hear from the gerrymanderers, who historically, because of who's been in power at the time of midterm elections, has been Republicans very often. We often hear that the lines are not drawn in a way that is particularly helpful to Republicans. But what we see here is that most of the scenarios that these guys were able to concoct, drawing the boundaries of the districts one way, another way, most of those scenarios led to Democrats winning 7 or 8 of 13 seats. The actual lines led to Republicans winning 9 of 13 seats while losing the popular vote. Let's talk about socialism, Lewis. We hear allegations of President Obama being socialist. Anytime he wants to put together any kind of policy that helps people, it is called socialism. And it turns out that this is not a new tactic. Republicans have been using socialist as an ad hominem for a really long time. And Matt Karp from the Early Americanists blog actually wrote a really interesting piece which points out very astutely that if you go back to figure out when the word socialism was first used in the congressional record, the first time that an allegation of socialism was made, it was when a North Carolina congressman was using the term socialism to attack opponents of slavery. So using socialism as an ad hominem dates back to when there was a contingent in the Congress that wanted to stop slavery. And Senator William King of Utah, before we even get to that, And a Republican senator said, no, 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 no. Banning slavery is a form of socialism, I guess because you were limiting the property that someone could have. In the early 20th century, Senator William King of Utah argued that banning child labor was a form of socialism. Then FDR wanted to create Social Security, which of course happened. And the American Family Association opposed that, saying it is an attempt to enact a compulsory socialistic tax. I had no idea, Louis, that the ad hominems of socialism reached so far back and that they attacked things that are so obvious today. Socialism is not having slaves. Socialism is not having child labor. Wow.
Yeah, it seems to be over time kind of an amorphous term. It still has a pretty negative connotation here. In other countries, it does not have that. And should we bring it back? I mean, should we call ourselves socialists? Should we try and take over here?
I don't know that that's really a good idea, because when you actually think about what socialism is, I understand conceptually the idea of kind of taking back a word to remove the power that it has. But when the word is very clearly defined and factually wrong, I don't know that you get the same benefit of sort of kind of taking the power back of that word. One other example, President LBJ wanted to enact Medicare. Ronald Reagan appeared in recordings for the AMA Operation Coffee Cup, arguing against Medicare because, quote, one of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism on people is by way of medicine. These are completely uncontroversial today, yet they were being called socialist when they were first proposed, just like today we hear that single-payer healthcare would be socialism, that the Affordable Care Act is socialism. And with Obamacare, it's even more absurd, because a program that gives 30 million new customers to for-profit insurers is obviously not socialist.
It's a powerful word, and it's been used quite a bit against Obama. I think we need to come up with another word to counter this. I guess using the word itself isn't going to get us very far.
Well, we've heard the idea of saying, oh, this is populist. This is for the people, and it is for what the majority of people would want, and that's what it is. It didn't
stick, though. It didn't stick.
It didn't stick, and I don't know that it's actually that good. So you're right. There needs to be more language, and I feel like George Lakoff would be the guy to kind of be the Frank Luntz of the left and figure out what language should be used. I just don't think enough people pay attention to Lakoff.
People don't pay enough attention to language. I think that's one of the big problems.
Texas Governor-elect, a Republican, Greg Abbott, said earlier this week that President Obama violated the U.S. Constitution with the directive that could shield up to 5 million immigrants from deportation. And he is now expecting to file a lawsuit in the coming weeks, amplifying Texas as a vanguard in the growing chorus of conservative states that are arbitrarily and based on an incredible level of hypocrisy, opposed to President Obama's use of executive orders. Abbott is still acting as the state's attorney general. He has not yet filed the legal challenge, but says, quote, odds are in favor that a lawsuit will be filed. He went on to say, I think it's incredibly important to emphasize that I'm addressing this as a legal issue, not a political issue. The president has crossed the line from politics to endangering the constitutional structure. Would Greg Abbott have filed the same lawsuit against George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan or any of the presidents since Dwight D. Eisenhower that have enacted similar legislation via executive order around immigration? Something tells me, Louis, that he probably would not have done that.
George Bush basically wanted this. He did everything but this final piece of legislation that Obama just, that put into law unilaterally. But no, of course he wouldn't have. This is just the Republican game. It's about destroying Obama.
And he's really getting off to a good start. Right away, he's just now elected governor of Texas. Quickly sue Obama. That really went well for John Boehner so far, didn't it?
Yeah. Did he campaign on suing Obama? Is that what helped him get this seat? I don't know. It seems like a total waste of time. It's
also not at all fiscally conservative, because squandering money with ridiculous lawsuits that will obviously go nowhere is really not fiscal conservatism. I thought he was being elected as the small government fiscal conservative guy, and he's going out and claiming that he is going to waste money on lawsuits that are not going to go anywhere.
There's a lot of stuff happening in Texas that is not fiscally conservative. You can thank Rick Perry for a lot of that, and I'm sure soon you'll be thanking Greg Abbott for it.
Remember that you can get your David Pakman Show Patriot Mail calendars for free with a David Pakman Show membership at davidpakman.com/calendar15. This is the calendar. Lewis, we're having trouble keeping up with these. We are actually we have something like 25 calendars that have been ordered, and we're out of calendars. We're waiting for our next shipment because these are so popular. And you can get just the calendar at davidpakman.com/calendar15 as well. I know you have your calendar already, Lewis. What exactly are you doing with it? Have you burned it? Have you put it up on the wall?
I used it as a hat for a little while, and it is now in the kitchen on a wall. And as soon as the new year rolls around, I will be using it as my only calendar.
And this is huge because you're 30 years old now, and you essentially have refused to keep a calendar for most of your life.
I've never had a calendar. I'm kind of worried about this. Not that I'm the best at remembering things, but I feel like if I rely too heavily on the calendar, I'll lose whatever it is I've got going on right now.
What I don't get is a lot of times you go to your dentist cleaning. Your next one is 6 months away. You don't write that down anywhere?
Well, it's on a little card they give you.
And then what do? Do you organize the cards and keep them on a desk and check in on them or something?
They're usually in a place where, there's a little spot that I reserve for things coming up in the future that aren't necessarily written down on a calendar. Just, I have a way of remembering. But also they call you and remind you of your appointment.
So you depend on other people to let you know your schedule, basically.
Sometimes.
All right. Well, listen, that was Lewis's technique for 30 years. He now has the Patriot Mail calendar, and he's using a calendar for the first time. So I would call it mission accomplished. davidpakman.com/calendar15. We'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Did you know that study after study after study has shown that increasing taxes on the rich does not kill jobs? Isn't that weird? The only possible conclusion is that the word study itself has a liberal bias. Find out more at liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is William Charles. William Charles, one of the many David Pakman Show members with two first names as first name and last name. Lewis, you're really into that, right?
I'm a big fan. That's really all I can say about it.
So Ron Paul is one of your favorite names.
I love Ron Paul. Yeah, especially when both names are one syllable. That's just taking it to the next level.
Thank you to William Charles. You can join William as a David Pakman Show member by going to davidpakman.com/membership. What are the benefits of membership? There's a whole other show just for members. It is called The Bonus Show. You also get a commercial-free podcast feed of the podcast and the bonus show just for members. You get full 1-hour commercial-free TV show videos and so much other great stuff. And over the next few days, you can get a free David Pakman Show Patriot Mail calendar with your membership at davidpakman.com/calendar15. And remember, any Amazon shopping that you do, the holiday gift buying season is upon us. You can help support our show. Go to our website, davidpakman.com, and click on the Amazon banner on the right side of the page. This week in show history, this is a great week, Lewis. A lot of stuff happened this week in history. 2 years ago, the Wall Street Journal completely ignored George W. Bush in a chart and article about historical GDP growth of recent two-term presidents. We wondered whether George W. Bush was just being erased from history altogether. And it seems now George W. Bush only comes up when very specific topics are being discussed. Otherwise, it's like he never happened.
Right. So basically 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, torture and surveillance.
Not very flattering topics for him.
No, not at all. It's history is not looking favorably upon Bush.
There are presidents that are not discussed because nothing that notable happened during their presidential terms. But George W. Bush was number one, very recent, and number two, tons of notable stuff happened during his presidential terms, mostly bad stuff. So it is weird that he's already being kind of written out of history.
Yeah, he is. But I think that those certain things that we're talking about that, that happened during his presidency will always be talked about. They are monumental things. They're very important things. But how will Bush be looked at? Ultimately, will he be Reaganized?
Well, remember, Lewis, that when he was still president and he was outgoing, there were some right-wingers who were saying George W. Bush will be looked back at as one of the best presidents we ever had, which would be kind of like a Reaganization from the Republicans. Republicans love Reagan. Of course, others recognize that Reagan made a ton of terrible mistakes and actually wasn't even that conservative on many issues. But putting that aside, I don't think that George W. Bush is going to become the Republican Ronald Reagan Part 2.
Yeah, I really doubt it. I mean, the numbers didn't look good for either president. Of course, Reagan still became a hero. But anytime these wars, torture, and surveillance come up, you'll have to talk about George W. Bush.
Also, 2 years ago this week, Bill O'Reilly confronted the president of American Atheists, David Silverman, about the war on Christmas. Do you think that the war on Christmas stuff is dying out? Because I'm still hearing it this year, but not quite so much. But really now, this week is when it would start, because we're now getting into just a few weeks from Christmas. The trees are going up and all of this. So I think if we're going to hear about it, it'll be within the next week.
Probably. And it'll start when someone demands to have a nativity scene taken, dismantled from their downtown area or something like that. I'm sure it will come up.
It's funny how people just saying, I reserve the right to be free of Christianity. Like if I don't want Christianity to be part of my life, I want to be free to make that decision. That's what's been interpreted as a war against Christmas.
Yeah, it's being shoved down our throats, and a lot of people don't like it. I mean, I guess I'm used to it. I'm numb to it, and I can just kind of ignore it. We talk about it here on the show, but it makes people angry.
There's this really funny double standard where you hear from the Christian right that by having marriage equality, it's shoving homosexuality down the throats of Christians, right? But eliminating the separation of church and state is not shoving Christianity down anyone's throat in their mind. It's just this ignorant double standard where equality, that's really anti-Christian and bad and we're bullying people. But lack of equality when it comes to religion, that's perfectly acceptable.
Perfectly acceptable. The world revolves around them, and that's what you need to know.
1 year ago this week, Mike Huckabee labeled Lara Logan a hero journalist for her discredited report about Benghazi. Whether or not someone is a hero has become completely subjective. I mean, people who are crusading to discriminate legally against non-Christians and gays are considered heroes in some circles. So the term hero has lost quite a bit of meaning in my mind. The entire thing with the Benghazi report, particularly now that we have had report after report, including the recent Intel panel report, Intel committee report that says there was no intelligence failure nor conspiracy around Benghazi, makes Mike Huckabee's claim that the wildly inaccurate and discredited report by Lara Logan was in any way heroic. It's just laughable.
Yeah. Some other recent heroes were Chelsea Manning, Snowden, Assange. These are people who were called heroes. And that, of course, also seems completely subjective. But Lara Logan, a hero? I don't think so. I don't see it.
A lot of times you're a hero if you've done something for the greater good, in spite of maybe personally you took a risk or something bad happened to you or something like that. And it's hard to imagine that some of the individuals that have been called heroes really fit that. I mean, we still get emails from people that say that Stalin and Hitler were kind of heroes in a way. To who? Who were they heroes to? Even their own people, for the most part, at least very soon thereafter, said, no, these guys were not going in the right direction for our country.
I mean, if you're a president who, let's just say in some crazy hypothetical situation, somehow manages to provide food and energy to all people of the United States for the rest of time.
But it comes at the cost of anyone else outside the U.S. having food.
Everyone else in the world suffers horribly as a result of this.
Right.
Is that person a hero?
Well, to many in the U.S., they probably would be, right?
Yeah, I guess so. And to plenty of others in the U.S., despite having all that food and energy, they would be a total villain. So it is just completely subjective.
Yeah, the term hero is increasingly ambiguous and also kind of valueless. It has very little meaning to me because of the skewed nature of who could really be determined to be a hero. All right, we have a fantastic program for you today. Great interview coming up. We're going to take your audience questions. We have an incredible bonus show. Make sure to give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I've been getting a lot of emails from people saying, hey, David, have you heard of this guy, Walid Shoebat? He's a former terrorist. He's now a kind of anti-Muslim guy. Would you consider interviewing him? And this made me realize many people don't know that we've interviewed him many times. And as we have new people come into our audience, they, of course, don't have the time, as no one would, to go back and see all of the stuff that we've done. So I thought for this week's classic interview, we would go back to an interview from almost 3 years ago this week with Walid Shoebat. And Walid Shoebat claims to have been a former terrorist. And this is I say this in this way because some of the claims that he has made have been called into question. And we've had him on the show a few different times. We've talked about many different topics, but we had him on in January of 2012 very specifically to talk about the fact that many of his assertions have been called into question. So let's take a look at the interview first. Walid Shoebat is joining us back on the show. He's a former member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He's been on the program before. He's also written several books, including For God or For Tyranny and God's War on Terror. Pleasure to have you back on the show.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
So we've been looking at what some are calling a cover-up by politicians obeying the first commandment of playing politics, as you have said, as it comes to implicating Iran. This is a story that a lot of people just don't have on their radar. So give me kind of a background for the allegation you're making.
Well, you have Nouri al-Maliki as a delegation to the Oval Office to the United States, accompanied by the head of the Minister of Transportation of Iraq, who is Hadi al-Amiri. Many Americans began to object regarding al-Amiri's connection to the Khubar Tower terrorist attack. Although the United States government tried to squash the voices of victims, families, survivors, the government issued a release stating that there is no evidence of al-Amiri being involved in any act of violence against U.S. citizens. Well, the first question I ask is, despite the argument that al-Amiri, the claim that al-Amiri didn't have any connection to al-Khubar Tower, al-Amiri is well known to have been involved with Iran to squash any opposition in Iraq, and that includes assassinations and terrorism in Iraq itself.
Yeah, no, let me just jump in here because that I think gives us a good starting point at least. And what was interesting to me, and I don't think you'll mind me going down this path because we've talked about this before, is that this idea that you say, it is claimed that there is no evidence of links to terrorism, but you have found A, B, and C and you're aware of. It's interesting because that's the same thing a lot of people have said about your story as well, right? I mean, it's fascinating because you told the story previously on our show about you throwing the bomb at Bank Leumi, an Israeli bank in Bethlehem, and spending spending time in prison. And when we look at that, many people say, well, there's no evidence of that. The Israeli government has denied that that happened. The bank has denied that that happened. There's no evidence that Walid Shoebat spent any time in jail. And you have contested that. So there is a similarity in the claim, is there not?
Yes, except it's in reverse. The Iraqi government does not want to be associated or linked to any terrorist activity. I'm the only terrorist that is wanting to be convicted for my actions. In fact, you will never find any Israeli official or any Israeli government official or police official that would state that I was never in prison. You'll never find that. This simply doesn't exist. It's simply a claim. However, the claim is made by CNN. And of course, if everybody wants to believe a claim made by CNN, that's up to them. However, I wasn't hit with amnesia, basically, to be reminded that I was never a terrorist. I know who I was. In fact, all the peripherals to my story can be proven beyond shadow of a doubt. The connections that I mentioned, the family members that were involved in terrorism. How did CNN find my home and my location and my family and brought false testimonies from Palestinians? Some of my relatives. However, there are people who I know who are willing to testify that they know who I am and they know the claims I make is true from my own village.
Well, why do you think? I'm actually very curious because I think you're referring to the July 13th CNN Anderson Cooper report where they said they claimed to have spoken to Israeli government officials and that they all said we have no record of this person ever committing this attack and we have no record of jail time. And then they also interviewed your cousin who said, I don't know that Walid Shoebat has any ties to any kind of movement at all. So why would they, I mean, do you believe that they coerced your cousin into saying that? Does your cousin have reasons to claim not to know anything about it?
Well, my fourth cousin, by the way, it's not my first cousin. He was with me in the Jeep with the military when I was arrested. The reason they brought him is because in town he was known to have been a grunt worker working for the Israelis because they need somebody to speak Arabic. So he spoke Arabic, he's from the village, and he was working for the Israelis. In fact, the translation on CNN regarding what my fourth cousin said is absolutely false. If you go to the Arabic language, in fact, I should be translating the Arabic language and showing it. This is not what he stated. He stated that he was experienced working for the military, and I haven't heard anything come through my desk, but the translation itself was convoluted. So obviously CNN wanted to repeat an old lie that was expressed by a journalist in the Jerusalem Post. And by the way, people can download my rebuttal in the Jerusalem Post. And why did the Jerusalem Post issue a rebuttal? Because the Jerusalem Post regretted the article have slipped under their eyes without scrutinizing it, and they wanted to rectify the mistake.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I have to be honest. When the last time we had you on, I received so many emails, some saying this is all a fraud and some saying it's for real. And I've done a lot of research on this. And I have to say, I don't really know what I think about it because there is so much that you say which is accurate. These translations can become convoluted. You have issued a rebuttal. And at the same time, there are conflicts, you know? I mean, in 2008, the Jerusalem Post asked you if there were news reports about your bombing, and you said, I don't know, I didn't read the papers because I was hiding for 3 days. But in 2004, and correct me if I'm wrong, you told the Britain Sunday Telegraph, I was terribly relieved when I heard on the news later that evening that no one had been hurt or killed by the bomb. That's a direct conflict, isn't it?
Yes, it sounds as a direct conflict if you read it that way. But that's not what I stated. I said when I heard the news that there was no one killed. Well, I mentioned in detail what the news was when my father had Muhammad Mar'i al-Atrash in our house. And I asked him, was anybody killed? And he said, no one was killed. So I was relieved at the news. And so the word news got expanded to mean that I heard on the news. The bombing itself wasn't on the news. The near lynching was in the news. In fact, I have a newspaper clipping. I've been researching in depth into this, and I found a newspaper clipping with the lieutenant governor or the military governor of Bethlehem who has been injured So there is a story that I mentioned in my history that I can prove beyond shadow of a doubt that existed.
See, I can understand that. I understand that explanation. I do understand that explanation. I mean, why do you think that there is this, if you use the word, I don't know if you do, but why does this conspiracy exist to try to disprove that you participated in this? I mean, what's the interest in saying you didn't participate?
Well, look, I mean, if you look at the news or internet, what circulates the news, I'm a fraud, Kamal Salim is a fraud, Brigitte Gabriel is a fraud, all of us are frauds. So, there is an interest by the left and to squash the voices from the East, because these voices from the East are telling it as is, and they are basically, giving the news from the Middle East as is, translating the documents as is, as I'm doing here.
Well, but hold on a second. That may be true in some of the cases, but do you deny that this industry does exist among fundamentalist Christians of touting these former Muslims in the same way that the anti-gay community brings out these former gay people? Do you deny that that exists at all in the United States?
Can't deny that at all. There is, people are elated to hear somebody who's an ex-terrorist, but I was the first one to come up in this industry, number one. Number two, in fact, if you look at my record, from the moment that I began to go public until 2004, 2005, my books and my material were downloadable for free of charge. I didn't collect a cent for many, many years. Does that make any sense? If I had special interest or material interest to promote myself, I simply sold my first book, what was it, 2004. 1994, I was active, 10 years.
But you have now profited significantly from your story. There's no denying that.
Well, I wouldn't say significantly, an author gets paid. However, the problem in America, what I found out, is that people don't read your material unless they paid for it. So once I started printing my book, in fact, Israel and the World's Mock Trial, you can go back to 1995 and download this material for free of charge. Why would I, for 10 years, promote all the works that I've done free of charge? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, like I've said, and we really got off on a side story there, but I find the story so fascinating, and there are so many sides and so many factors here. I've done so much research on it. We'll continue to talk to you. We're actually out of time. We'll have to have you back, and we can then delve more deeply into Iran, because it's another fascinating story. But I do thank you for coming on again, Walid Shoebat.
You bet. Take care.
So having seen this interview, if you would be interested in another interview with Walid Shoebat, it's been almost 3 years since the last time he was on, let me know. I know that most of the emails I received were kind of under the umbrella of, because you've never had this guy on, maybe you should have him on. We have had him on 2 or 3 times. It's been almost 3 years since the most recent time. If you want to see Walid Shoebat on our program, let me know. We actually do get pitched Walid as a guest pretty often by his publicist, so it would not be a difficult thing to have him on. But if you think we've heard from him enough and there's really nothing more to say, nothing has happened in the last 3 years that makes you want to hear from him, then we won't have him on. Let us know.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's time for audience questions. We have some fantastic audience questions for you. Remember, any question you want us to answer, political, personal, cultural, entertainment, sports, religious, whatever, you can contact us through our website, davidpakman.com, or leave us a voicemail at 219-2DavidP, or of course, tweet us your Friday show questions, leave them as comments on our Facebook page, whatever is easiest for you. First question today is from Jean, and Jean says, I was wondering, I live in the Bible Belt, but I'm from New York City, so I am a huge liberal. Is it within the realms of polite conversation to disagree politely with my Republican friends when they come to my home and discuss religion or politics? My husband says you cannot think that politics is personal, and that I need to keep the two separate. But I cannot, and I believe politics is very personal, and sometimes I have to say something, especially when they are very right-wing conservatives. This is a really interesting question. I've been in situations many times where at a table, it could be with friends, it could be with family friends, it could be with my girlfriend's family, could be whoever, right? And a conversation comes up that's political or religious, and it's very clear that I don't agree with at least some of the statements that are being made, some of the opinions that are being presented. My instinct is usually, unless I'm completely comfortable with the group, not really to say anything at all. And when people know what I do, sometimes there will be kind of a look to me to get me to comment. And when I do, I err on the side of saying as little as possible and being as polite as possible. And I try to avoid those conversations only because why do I want to get into a very uncomfortable situation with people I will likely have to see again? That being said, the situation Jean is describing sounds like one where people are coming into her home and are making these political or religious statements. And if Jean's husband believes it is rude for her to impose her beliefs on those who are in her home, I think that it is also rude for those who are in her home to even bring these topics up. Or let me say it another way. If you're going to go into someone else's home and start talking about religion or politics, you have to be prepared for the reality that they may disagree and they may present their opinion. And if the tension is going to be pointed at Jean simply for saying, oh, you know, I don't agree with what you're coming into my home and saying, then that seems to me like a very unfair standard. If really if what we're agreeing upon is that we don't want political or religious discussions and that those are impolite, it seems to me not to cause a problem between Jean and her husband, but that Jean's husband should be equally as forceful in telling those coming into their home and espousing their political beliefs that it may not be the right venue for that. So I don't see anything impolite at all about saying that you disagree with someone, even when it's in your home, even when you're trying to not start a tense situation. I don't see anything at all that would preclude you from doing that. Personally, I try to just avoid these conversations altogether outside of the show because this is a very particular venue. I've gotten used to talking about politics in a way that is often very direct and very adversarial, and it doesn't really serve much of the social purpose to engage in that type of argument in these personal situations. Tell me what you think about this. Next question. Allison wrote to me, David, if there was a military draft today, would you go? There's kind of two answers to this. Question one, which I guess is the most general way to answer it, is would I be opposed to going into the military, period, regardless of what the circumstances are? And I guess the question is no. I mean, putting my age aside and the fact that I think I would be too old at this point, at 30, to be drafted anyway, I don't have a problem in broad terms with a military and being in a military. Okay, that's as a general thing. When we apply it specifically to the decades of American foreign policy and my understanding of what types of incursions I may be involved in if I were to be drafted or join the American military, no, I would not have any eagerness to participate in that. And as the question says, if there were a military draft, would you go? I guess if there were a draft, I wouldn't really have a choice other than, of course, being a conscientious objector, a status which you can request. And that often leads to your total non-involvement in the military during a time of a draft or possible kind of civil service or working in health or some other social service type of circumstance. So would I join the military? Certainly not. If I were drafted, I would likely, depending on what was going on, based on the U.S. military objectives over the last 30, 40, 50 years, I would most likely say that I cannot in good conscience do this, and I would not be an asset. I would be a detriment because of my disagreements with the broader foreign policy that the U.S. military has engaged in. Now, I've gotten emails from people saying that because I'm not American, whatever it is that that means to our audience, that I don't have to worry about a draft and I can just criticize. I am an American citizen, and if when I was 19 or 20 or 22 or 24 there had been a draft, I would not have been any more exempt from that than anybody else, aside from the possibility of filing for conscientious objector status. So that argument to me is kind of a distraction. I'd be curious to hear from the audience, though, if there were a draft now, or let's not say a draft, let's say there were a call for volunteers for the military because of some particular need that arose. What types of military activity would make you, audience members of our show, more likely to say, yes, sign me up? And what would make you more likely to say absolutely not? You know, after 9/11, we saw many people, many of whom we've interviewed on the show. We've had letters from audience members who fall into this category who said, I want to join because of what's going on with 9/11. And then, unfortunately, sadly, tragically, frustratingly, in a way that should really anger us and does anger me, a lot of those troops who joined because of 9/11 were then sent to Iraq, a place that made absolutely no sense to go into. I won't bore you with the details of that story. You're probably familiar with that at this point. So let me know what you think about this. Third question today is from Carlos. Carlos says, you talk about spending priorities often, and you've also expressed your support of space exploration. Would it not be better to spend money feeding the millions and millions of hungry people in the world than landing spacecraft on comets? Carlos, I think, referring to the recent landing of a craft on a comet. Okay, this is a really good question, and I think that we are mixing two issues here. One is, should we be focusing more on things like feeding the millions of hungry people? We talk about the issue of hunger all the time. We talk about the issue of poverty all the time, etc. At the same time, I have been a very big advocate of space exploration. So for me, imagine that we take all of the things that the federal government spends money on and we order them. And at the top of the list are those which you believe to be the best priorities. And at the bottom of the list, you put what you think are the biggest wastes of money. Since I don't consider space exploration to be at the bottom of the list, and I certainly consider hunger and poverty to be near the top of the list, I wouldn't say, let's take something from the middle and stop spending there to fix something from the top of my list of priorities. I would go to the bottom. You're going to get the best increase in spending efficiency by taking the worst priorities and moving that money to the best priorities. So I would not cut funding for space exploration to feed the homeless. I would say, whoa, look at what we're spending on defense. Look at the size of our military. We don't need 40 military bases in Germany. We would probably be just as safe with 12 or 15 military bases in Germany. Let's take the savings there and put it into feeding the poor. So to answer Carlos's question, I agree with the underlying premise that our priorities are completely off in terms of federal spending. And I agree with Carlos's assertion that we should be spending more money on fixing the hunger problem, which is completely within reach. I mean, we've talked about this. We have the resources. This is not a resource problem. This is not a money problem. It's an allocation and distribution issue. So yes, Carlos, let's reorganize the federal budget to focus more on solving the poverty and hunger and homelessness problem. But let's not take the money away from space exploration, which is already drastically underfunded. Let's reduce the size of the military-industrial complex. Let's shrink defense spending a little bit here. Let's look at the military-industrial complex and the war on drugs and the amount of money that is being spent to fight that war on drugs, a pointless war, a war that makes no sense. So let's start at the bottom. Let's not go to space exploration. And yes, let's work on that poverty and hunger problem. Great questions this week. Send your questions to us via our website, davidpakman.com, or via voicemail, 219-2DAVID-P. We will talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.